Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Davey Peppers, and I don't have anything funny to say. I still miss Halloween. Let's just keep on rolling with the movies. And we got 4 very interesting films from all walks of life from 2020 to talk about today. So we are going to start off with a review of the recently released The Craft Legacy. Then we're going to go on to a review of The Informer. And then we are going to go a few months back to 2 films that are or are about to be readily available for your viewing pleasure. Shirley, and then The New Mutants. But let's start off with The Craft Legacy. Written and directed by Zoe Lister-Jones, who made a splash 2 years ago with her independent movie Band-Aid, which I really liked. This is a sequel, kind of a reboot of 1996's The Craft, which I discussed in the Halloween double features that I was doing. Yes, this was planned. So this film stars Kaylee Spaney as Lily, a young woman who, with her mom, played by Michelle Monaghan, are moving to a new town, trying to figure out how to move forward, because Michelle Monaghan's character, Helen, has a new boyfriend, and she's probably going to marry him, and wants to try and integrate their families together. The boyfriend, Adam, played by David Duchovny. Lily doesn't really like him, and definitely doesn't like his children, her potential soon-to-be stepbrothers, and she feels generally kind of outcasty when she meets up with basically using the same premise as the first film, meets up with 3 young women that are trying to build a coven, are in need of a 4th, and witness the fact that Lily has some kind of very special power. These 3 students: Frankie, played by Gideon Adlon, Pamela Adlon's daughter; Tabby, played by Lovie Simone; and Lourdes, played by Zoe Luna. And these 4 women, over the course of the film, do the traditional The Craft Chronicle type of thing. They figure out that they have a severe amount of power and use it to the best of their abilities until their abilities start to use the best of them. And chaos ensues generally. Immediately, without going too deep into spoilers, the thing about The Craft Legacy that sets it apart from the original, both for better and for worse, is that this film is much more specific with what it wants to do and what it wants to say. And because of that, and because of trying to avoid some of the tropes that the original film fell into, I feel like it makes a far weaker film because it doesn't have a lot to replace the campy, slightly in bad taste nature of that original film. There are a lot of really severe, serious topics in that first film, and in this film as well, that I think are good to express and normalize for young audiences to see. But the campiness and kind of silliness of the original Craft definitely, at least in my opinion, buoyed it, when a much more serious film probably would have gotten a lot more flack from me and from others for how it handled its subjects, which was schlocky and sensationalist. And that's not to defend the decisions made there, but also that was 1996, and honestly, good on them for even trying to discuss these topics. Here it is with a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer, but there are so many things that don't get the same treatment, that don't get the same storytelling gravitas that they had in that first film, where this is a much more polite and generally safe film, I would say, than the first, which, while I understand the desire to do that, it's definitely a reflection of the 24 years of cultural differences that have happened from that first film to now. It feels ultimately really toothless. There isn't the level of mischief here that there was with the original film, and while I definitely do feel that these characters do generally and genuinely like each other, which honestly I wasn't necessarily expecting to have a lot of affection for the group dynamics in this film, outside of that, there's really little going on. It's very standard, and I feel like it is best designed for people who loved the craft as a teenager and now have a teenager of their own, so that you guys can marathon the two of them and kind of share the love of the original to the next generation. And I mean, that is what this is trying to do. It's trying to bring this idea and these themes into a new generation, but I never felt that the generational gap was bridged as well as it probably could have been. There are definitely a lot of little fun things, especially near the end, that directly tie this to that original film. But outside of a lot of lip service and the general premise, there isn't a lot here that reminds me of what made the craft good. It reminds me of the aesthetics and the camaraderie and this very subtle, almost passively countercultural way of making a teen film. Where in the first film, simply having a film directly catered to the interests of teenage girls was, in a very passive way, countercultural. Now we have various things like one of these witches, Lourdes, played by Zoe Luna, is trans, played by a trans actress. And that's really cool, and they don't make a big deal out of it. It just is there, and that's just a nice thing. And that just made me happy, and I wanted to share that with you all. But little moments like that are really good never really seem to bolster the movie out of this kind of middling, self-serious, and condescending's not the right word, because it's not condescending, it's deeply genuine, but it feels somewhat misguided in simple things like the verbiage used. There is, much like in the first film, there is a boy who is the worst and slowly gets better. While it doesn't go as dark as that first film does, it's kind of a recurring joke throughout the first half of the film that he becomes basically a staunch feminist, which is fun and interesting. But the way that character is written, almost parroting years and years of research and sociology writing that never feels natural, it's representative of the bigger problem with this film, in that it's paying more lip service to these ideas than actually embracing them and trying to find something meaty to discuss with them in their own right. And that's kind of a shame. Honestly, it reminds me, more than anything, it reminds me of the Black Christmas reboot from last year, which is a really, really, really bad movie with a lot of interesting and creative and clever ideas. And while the craft legacy is nowhere near the patronizing, simplistic train wreck that movie is, it does share the same problem. And I'm being mean to the Black Christmas remake, but it's really bad. The thing that connects that film with this one is that it's trying to modernize these broad strokes of counterculturalism, and it doesn't seem to get why that counterculturalism worked, and it is descendant from those original films and treats them with such reverence that they never really seem to make a place of their own. Comparing that to something like the 2018 Halloween reboot that I think is really successful in directly mirroring the themes of that original film into a new generation and into a new structure and into a new type of story and a new type of movie. There is stuff there that was not and could not have been in the original version. And with the Craft Legacy or the Black Christmas reboot, I feel like outside of the words being used and the slight greater push into acceptance, culturally speaking, I don't think there's anything that this movie does that couldn't have been done in 1996. And that, for a movie that seems to pride itself, and I would argue rightfully so, I think movies that actively try to push boundaries and make things normalized should be accepted and should be appreciated. But for a movie that is seemingly resting most of its laurels on either that or nostalgia, and it gets the nostalgia right, I'll give it that. But the other thing it's resting on, I feel like it's not as strong in that department as it really should be, or at least as it thinks it is. And I think a lot of that comes down to the decisions made in the third act, which obviously can't spoil, because the third act is the last act, usually, unless you're doing something real wonky with your structure. And I do, at some point, want to try and discuss what this movie does in its final 30 minutes or so. But as for right now, it doesn't want to be a cautionary tale. And it can't be just a fun romp. Because there is the baggage of the original film, of that cautionary tale weighing over this film. So, what is this movie doing? It is reminding us how good The Craft was. And it's not even that The Craft is a great movie. It's a ton of fun, and I liked it a lot, but it's not a great movie, and that makes it all the more disappointing when the biggest thing that the Craft Legacy has going for it is that it is also there. And it is just tagging along on the coattails of that original film. I can't really blame... Obviously, I can't blame the cast. The young cast are, as I've said, all very good at being young actresses who seem to generally and genuinely, again, sorry, I'm using that phrase again, they like each other. And you can tell that they actually like each other in real life, and that's exciting, and that's good, and you can feel that genuine, palpable energy. And I don't blame Zoe Lister-Jones either, mostly because I've seen her previous film, and I know that she is a very talented filmmaker. If you haven't seen Band-Aid, which most people haven't, because it made like $4, it is a really solid indie music rom-com, and I highly recommend it. And I'm excited to see what she does next. I think maybe there's a place for her doing some more kind of horror, but I mean, not that The Craft was ever really horror. It's more just a fantasy teen drama, but I think there is potential here, and honestly, there is a small setup for a third film, and yeah, I'd watch it. And not just because I watch everything, but I think there is potential with these ideas and with this franchise and utilizing what the franchise has represented to people in the past and what it continues to represent to people to make something interesting and to make something fresh. I just don't think that this was the thing that did it. The Craft Legacy gets 4 out of 10 stars. So now, if you will stick around, we are going to hop on over to another review of a recently released 2020 film, The Informer, with Joel Kinnaman, before we close out with two slightly older, by a couple months, releases for Shirley and the New Mutants. So stick around for all those. It's gonna be a lot of fun, and I will try very hard not to reuse the phrase generally and genuinely again this episode. And if I do, I am sorry.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
So now let's move on to a review of the recently released on VOD and in a small limited release, The Informer, directed by Andrea Di Stefano, written by Matt Cook, Stefano, and Rowan Joff, based on the novel 3 Seconds. So this movie stars Joel Kinnaman as Pete Coslow, a former criminal and former soldier who has decided to basically get out of the drug game by working undercover for 2 FBI handlers to try and take down a drug trade in New York City run by the Polish Mafia. These FBI handlers are played by Rosamund Pike and Clive Owen, with Clive Owen being like the up top ultimate head of this division. I don't know how the FBI works. But Pete and his wife, Sophia, played by Ana de Armas, are trying to get out, trying to be safe when a drug deal goes bad and an undercover NYPD officer ends up dead, which puts a other NYPD detective played by Common on their trail. Various things ensue as Pete has to go to prison to be undercover and has to do all these other stuff while undercover and fight for his life and yada yada. You've seen this movie before. I've seen this movie before. And it's not very good. The most interesting thing, at least for me, about The Informer is that it has been sitting on the shelf for a while now. It originally released in 2019 in the UK. I mean, it was originally a British produced film, and it didn't actually get a American release until this past week. And that said, it was filmed back in 2017. And if for no other reason, you can definitely tell by how much Ana de Armas's like personal style has changed since then. Like, this is very much the actress that was in Knock Knock, not the actress that was in Knives Out. And that is definitely one of the more interesting things that I have found about this movie, is seeing these performers from a couple of years ago. And some of those differences of just a couple of years are so stark, at least to me, that I already feel like I'm watching a relic. Obviously, that is not helped by the fact that this is not a terribly notable film, and that it all kind of comes together in a pretty standard and boring way. It has its traditional twists and turns, and you have these 5 characters. you have these 5 characters kind of colliding against one another. But ultimately, this movie just exists. It has a lot of similar problems to another fraughtly produced crime thriller starring Common that came out this year, Ava with Jessica Chastain, which I reviewed, I think, a month and a half ago. And while this movie is nowhere near as kind of empty and bland as that movie is, what it has is not terribly interesting, all things considered. It tries to be more thoughtful, which I will give it credit for, and that, if nothing else, gives it the edge above something like Ava, just because it's trying to be tense, and it's trying to give us something to work on, and showing these kind of conflicting morality plays going back and forth constantly. And while none of it really works and doesn't really have much going for it, the attempt is notable and the attempt is good. But none of it ever really sticks together. Joel Kinnaman, as much as I really liked him on The Killing, has shown that he just doesn't have the leading man potential that I think a lot of people told him that he had, which is a shame because he's a clearly very talented performer who has done some really good stuff in the past, but he just doesn't have the thing to hold these big kind of broad thrillers that he seems to be getting consistently cast in. And the same thing can be said for, honestly, the entire cast. It's a lot of people that feel out of their element. If they weren't such recognizable and kind of beloved names, I would have assumed that this movie would have gone straight to VOD, because it's that kind of movie. It's not a incompetently made film. It's not a particularly handsomely shot movie, but it's not badly put together. But nothing here really feels all that meaningful, I should say. Like, you have Rosamund Pike and Clive Owen and Ana de Armas and Common, who I've just never really been a fan of as an actor, all things considered, but you have all these people that all have a recognizable persona in the film industry, at least now, and none of them give performances that would let you know that if you didn't know that walking into the movie. This feels so workmanlike and so basic and uninvolved, honestly. And the uninvolvement is probably a thing that gives this movie a lot of its good graces, at least for me, because there aren't any chances taken. There isn't anything really worthwhile decided upon. And because of that, it's hard to say that it fails at anything. And maybe that's on me, but when I look at this film, especially compared to other crime thrillers, and I'm going to keep going back to the Ava train because that movie is really, really bad and also stars Common, so it's a good comparison point. Maybe it's better to not try. And I know that that's kind of against everything that I philosophically believe about the art of storytelling and the art of making a movie. But when I look at this film, when I look at The Informer, a movie that I watched less than 24 hours before recording this segment, there is nothing about it that sticks in my head, and maybe sometimes it's better to be forgotten than to be remembered for being bad. And I don't know how I feel about that conclusion, honestly. Because this shouldn't be bad, right? I've not seen DiStefano's previous film, Escobar Paradise Lost, which I have been told is fine, but I never got around to seeing it myself, so this was my first introduction to his work. But if that film's anything like this, then oof, what is... I'm trying to think of a nicer way to say it, but what's the point? What about this film, what about this story appealed to these actors or to these filmmakers? There isn't any meat here that really seems to do anything outside of a paycheck. Maybe some producers, because it's based off a novel, maybe the producers got a hold of the novel and just tried to fast track this and get it done and get it made, but none of these performers are completely bereft of work. I don't see anything in any of these characters that could offer something that would be a meaningful decision to go for. You know, nothing here that an actor would see and go, oh, like that's something that I can really work with maybe the exception of Joel Kinnaman, who is trying his hardest in the third act of this movie to sell it, and he doesn't, but it's not his fault. He doesn't based on the kind of poor writing and general cliche, but he is giving it his all and trying really, really hard to not be seen as just a character actor, although that is consistently where he has done his best work, and I'm really excited for him to be in the new Suicide Squad, because that will be good. That will be good for him to be in a ridiculous James Gunn movie. But that, I digress. The Informer is one of those movies that it's the movies that film people watch a lot in, like, January. And this was originally supposed to be released in January of this year, and it definitely feels like it. It's one of those movies that you put on your list of the year ranked, and it's a bit of a game. Like, this is a game that me and one of my friends will play all the time, where we will try and find the weirdest and most obscure movie that released in theaters over the past, 2 years, and we will just bounce various movies back and forth to try and stump the other person or try and make them go, I completely forgot about that movie. Because that's what I do for fun now with my life. But this is one of those movies, and outside of that value of being able to get a kind of bewildered giggle out of one of my friends, I don't see why this movie is going to have any notable impact on my brain or on my life. And while I am going to ultimately give it the same rating that I gave The Craft Legacy, I don't want it to be misconstrued, because if you only had to watch one of the two films that we talked about in the first half of today's episode, you should definitely watch The Craft Legacy, because it's at least trying for something. It has a few ideas in its head that it is working through and struggling to get out in a meaningful way. The Informer, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that thing in its bones that could make stuff work. And I can't think of a better way to say it. And it sounds extremely negative, but it's not. It's an easy watch. It is a turn your brain off, red box it, and just veg. And there is definitely some value to that. So if this is on Netflix or Hulu or something at some point and you need something to turn on while you go to sleep, yeah, this is a really, really good movie to watch while you go to sleep. The audio levels are pretty standard, and yeah, it's intense, quote unquote, but in the same way that a mid-season finale of Law and Order SVU is intense. You'll be fine. You can sleep through it and it'll be okay. And there is definite value there. And this movie will probably have a lot of fun on TNT once they cut all the F-bombs out. But that's not something to strive for, right? That's not something to look forward to. At least I don't think so. I don't know. There is there is something to be said for the bereft of thoughts that I have on a film like this. There is something to be said about the fact that there is nothing to be said about this film. And while The Informer is by no means the worst movie of the year, and it is not even the most forgettable movie of the year, it is a reminder that sometimes it is better to try and fail than to not try and succeed in that endeavor itself. At least I think so. I would rather fall on my face and look like a fool than skirt away with the C- that The Informer seems very, very comfortable in getting. So, you stayed out of the bottom, and I guess you passed, but at what cost, my friend? At what cost? The Informer gets 4 out of 10 stars. So now, we are going to go into 2 films that are a couple months older. We are going to do reviews of Shirley, and then we are going to do a review of the new Mutants before sending you on your merry little way. So stick around for that. It is going to be fun and definitely a little more chaotic. So stick around. Thank ya.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And now let's move on to a review of a movie that came out a couple of months ago. It came out in June after premiering at the Sundance Film Festival and is now available on Hulu if anyone is interested in watching it. Shirley, directed by Josephine Decker, written by Sarah Gubbins, based on the novel of the same name by Susan Scarf Merrill, and is one of the best movies of the year. So Josephine Decker, who came up around the mumblecore movement of the early 2010s, made one of the best films of the past decade, a movie called Madeline's Madeline, a sort of, how do you even describe this movie? A performance art thriller coming-of-age story. It is divisive and bold and brash and sometimes deeply uncinematic and one of the most incredible movies of this decade, and you should definitely check it out as soon as possible. And because of that, I was really excited to see this movie, Shirley, which stars one of the best working actresses today, Elizabeth Moss, as a fictionalized version of famous horror and genre writer Shirley Jackson. So this is around the 40s, I would say, with her and her husband, Stanley Hyman, around Bennington College, where Stanley is a professor. They take in 2 completely fictional characters, Rose and Fred, a young married couple played by Odessa Young and Logan Lerman, because Fred, Logan Lerman's character, is basically doing a bit of an apprenticeship job for Professor Stanley Hyman. And the bulk of the movie, what follows, is a sort of psychological, psychosexual drama following Shirley Jackson and Rose, Odessa Young's character, where they generally do not like each other and slowly start to find the common ground of what one of my friends calls I'm trying to remember the exact words, I believe the innate chaos princess. This desire for something more, something free from restrictions and free from any nonsense and meaningless rules that are just there for the sake of order. And obviously a lot of these themes that get brought up in this film connects to the themes and the fears brought up in Shirley Jackson's writing, with stories like The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House and a lot of other stories and novels that I have not read and am not familiar with. But if her very good writing wasn't enough to get me to pay attention to her work as a kind of titan of literary history, then this movie definitely pushed me along that track. What makes this movie so good, in addition to the traditional things like Elizabeth Moss's great performance, because she's fantastic. She's given two of the best performances of the year in this and The Invisible Man. And Josephine Decker's direction that is close-up and intimate and almost rebelling against the very nature of what a biopic should be, mostly because this is a fictional story and is not bound to any history, is only bound to the events that are public knowledge, and everything else can be created and crafted to expand upon themes and ideas from Jackson's work, is that this movie is a pressure cooker. It is tense, and it is sometimes hard to watch in its own way. You are seeing these four people trapped in this house that you never really completely understand the geography of, just kind of bouncing their energies off of one another and hitting their logical extremes. And it's just magic watching them work. In a way, it's similar to how the recent film I'm Thinking of Ending Things works, but where that movie takes the metaphysical, logical conclusion of the characters and of the situation, this is much more human. And yes, there are a lot of moments in the filmmaking, and Josephine Decker does this a great deal with her work, but there are a lot of moments in the filmmaking that are somewhat magical realistic or more based around themes and actual plot and concrete events. But unlike something like I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I feel that Shirley does a much better job at staying grounded in reality and making the fears and anxieties and paranoia of its center story and center relationship feel more palpable. And not to say that there's anything wrong with the more metaphorical, metaphysical difficulties brought forth by a movie like I'm Thinking of Ending Things, but there is definitely something almost relieving, if not just flat out better, about having a film that you don't have to Wikipedia the plot to know exactly what's going on. Although, to be said, I did Wikipedia, after this movie was done, I did Wikipedia some of the real-life events that this movie is surrounding to see how close it lines up with real events, and the connections and the small pieces of connective tissue between real life and this fictional story is very interesting and very bizarre, I would say. It's a movie that takes little crumbs of fact and builds them in a really exciting and interesting way. While this is definitely a much more extreme version of this example in terms of biopics or stories about notable figures of culture, this has a similar power to something like Rocketman, the Elton John biopic from last year, where things do not happen as they did. They happen as could happen based on the information given to the filmmakers. And yes, Elton John is still alive, where Shirley Jackson is not. And while I definitely commend Elton John for being so bold with allowing them to make a movie where he kind of comes off as a jerk, and a couple other words that I can't say, there is definitely a freedom and a sense of liberation to the filmmaking by sole virtue of making a movie about a real person who is no longer with us. For as bold as Rocketman is, you could never make a version of Rocketman that is basically Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And Shirley takes more from that play and film than from Shirley Jackson's actual life. It is transposing these elements of truth and of history and of literary titans and turning them into actual titans in their own right. Elizabeth Moss is great, but also Michael Stuhlbarg as her husband is legitimately terrifying in certain scenes. He is imposing and vicious in the slightest of ways, but never in a way that feels cruel. It always feels calculated and exact and with a purpose, which is honestly often more terrifying than anything done out of sheer blind emotionalism. So yeah, there are a lot of comparisons between Moss and Stuhlbarg in this film and the stars of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. There's definitely some Elizabeth Taylor in here. And that is really, really cool. And it also comes with some setbacks. The child of Jackson and Hyman has come out against this film and basically said, hey, you guys made my parents out to be terrible and obsessive and malicious and vicious people, and they're not. And I understand that, and I respect that. And I think that's definitely kind of the back and forth that has to come about when you're making a movie about a real person. Even one that has since passed on, if they have immediate family or immediate friends that knew them, it is difficult to look at this movie and say, oh, it's just fiction. It's just a story. Because it is still connected to real life people. And that is a complicated back and forth that no one has really ever been able to figure out, because if you are too harsh, then you can get stuff that really hurts people, and if you're too soft, you can make a milquetoast piece of garbage with no artistic value like Bohemian Rhapsody. Sorry, did I get off track there? Oh. I didn't get off track, that was planned. At the end of the day, you can talk in circles about if it's important to do the right thing when making a movie, and I think that conversation deserves to be had, and deserves to be had by people who are actually affected by it, as opposed to just people who are watching movies for the sake of watching movies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Movies are great, and I love them. However, my opinion as a viewer will never be as important as my opinion if it was me or my mom or my dad or my friends up on screen getting turned into themes, because people are not themes, people are people, and people are always going to be more complicated than we give them credit for, or we even have time to say in a film. Do I, as a minor student of storytelling, believe that Shirley Jackson might have appreciated how this film works? I do. But also, it doesn't really matter what I think, because I'm just a guy. I'm not the creator of this story. I am not a scholar of Jackson's works as a writer. I don't have a stake in this. So I think there is stuff to be said about why Sarah Gubbins, Susan Scarf Merrill, and Josephine Decker made this film. And there is something to be said about why the real life child of Hyman and Jackson was not taken with this movie. But I cannot have that answer. And I think it's fair if thinking about that could potentially make people uncomfortable. Or make them less easy to fall in love with this movie. Not that it's a particularly easy film to fall in love with anyway. It is definitely a purposefully abrasive and somewhat harsh to the touch of a film as it can be. But in terms of bold filmmaking, incredible performances all around. I mean, even Logan Lerman is like, he's holding his own. Odessa Young and Logan Lerman definitely get the short straw in this movie. Odessa Young does a pretty good job. Logan Lerman doesn't really have a ton to do, but I have seen him be really good in things in the past before, so I'm not going to particularly put the blame on him that he can't stand in the same space as Elizabeth Moss and Michael Stuhlbarg, two of the best actors of our generation. That's nobody's fault. That's totally okay. So with that caveat that, yeah, some of the performances do seem a little slighter in comparison to the two leads, there isn't really much about this movie that doesn't work. Even if it doesn't work for you, and there are definitely parts of it that didn't totally work for me, but it is all made with such a deft, intentional, powerful hand and acted with the same amount of gusto and brava that there is very little about this movie that isn't a net positive for filmmaking and for the conversation. And I think it's one of those movies that more people should watch because of how it expands and how it challenges what we know about telling these types of stories, both stories about real people and also stories about famous women that we have not really been great at doing. There is a lot of infantilization and a lot of watering down of real people to make them more palatable. And I think this movie going in the opposite direction and focusing almost exclusively on these characters and especially Shirley Jackson's more eccentric and some would say worst qualities is a pushback against the sanitization of history and of people's lives that is, I would argue, about as close to an objective good as you can get. You should watch Shirley. It's on Hulu now, and I really, really like it. Shirley gets 9 out of 10 stars. And now, to finish out, if you'll stick around just a little bit more, we are going to do a review of the soon-to-be-released on home video, New Mutants. So stick around for that. Thank you.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Thank you so much for sticking around. Now, to end out tonight's broadcast, we are going to do a review of one of the most interesting, somewhat controversial, and soon-to-be seemingly forgotten films of this year, The New Mutants. Now, what makes The New Mutants so interesting is that it has had multiple release dates over the past couple of years. It was originally supposed to come out in around 2018, and then it got delayed when films like Logan and Deadpool made the production company, 20th Century Fox, say, well, maybe we should do some reshoots and try and make this a little more unique. And then those fell through when Disney started to buy 20th Century Fox. And then that went through. They decided to complete the original version of the film and release it in April or so 2020. And then COVID. So it came out at the end of August of this year, and it is coming on DVD and VOD streaming this Tuesday. So this long-delayed, scrappy, weird little film that has kind of become a bit of a linchpin for the discussion around the Disney-Fox merger and what that could potentially mean for the future of these sorts of films, for these weirder superhero films centering predominantly around the X-Men franchise, which, for the record, is a franchise that is very near and dear to my heart. Is it actually any good? I was really expecting to say no. I was really expecting to do the whole bit of the big build-up and then say, no, it's actually terrible, and it was dumb of us to ever get our hopes up. Because I honestly have been really excited for this movie for about 3 years now. I like the cast, I like the idea, the concept of doing a superhero-tinted horror film seemed really, really exciting to me, and with as homogenous a lot of the superhero and really, really big blockbuster landscape can be, just the very idea of having something a little more personal and a little more intimate and branching out of what we know the genre to be was really exciting. Now, the New Mutants is not the holy beacon from above. It is not the thing that is going to rewrite the genre. But for a movie this, shall we say, critically undesired, this movie's not bad. It is a little cheap and a little shoddy, and some of the acting isn't awesome, but it is sweet and weird and creative and creepy. And going from absolute excitement just at what the film would represent to sheer dread for years as it kept getting pushed back to eventually, once the reviews came out, the pit in my stomach sinking saying, oh no, this wasn't good, to finally watching it and going, it was pretty alright, is a weird journey, and it's one that I think should be commended. And maybe I'm giving it too much credit because it was a little bit of my little engine that could. I am not a fan of the Fox-Disney merger, just in general. So seeing kind of the last bastion of 20th Century Fox as a production company, it's kind of nice, honestly. It's a little, it makes me a little nostalgic. It's a similar feeling to how I felt watching Ad Astra and Ford v Ferrari last year. These movies that still had that Fox logo on it, and it's kind of feeling wistful for a small and ultimately unimportant piece of the cinematic landscape that is falling apart and is going to be going by the wayside. So what is the movie actually about? So the film follows Danny Moonstar in the comics, later the superhero known as Mirage, played by Blue Hunt, who is a Cheyenne Native American mutant who doesn't totally know what her powers are. All she knows is a huge, horrible tornado devastated the reservation that she and her family were living on, and she was the only survivor. And that's all she knows. She wakes up in a hospital / psychiatric facility / some rundown building that they could film in with 4 other young teenage mutants that are clearly a risk either to the outside world or to themselves. We have Maisie Williams as Rain Sinclair, later in the comics known as Wolfsbane, a young Scottish woman who can turn into a wolf and has a lot of severe religious guilt. We have Anya Taylor-Joy as Ilyana Rasputin, in the comics later known as Magic, a Russian sorcerer who is... Her biggest character trait for most of the film is that she's racist and uses a lot of off-color remarks to refer to the lead character, to refer to Danny, which is not terribly interesting, but Anya Taylor-Joy is just a good enough actress to make the cheesier reveals of why she's so closed off and therefore why she says racist things actually compelling. Then we have Charlie Heaton, who most people will know from Stranger Things as Sam Guthrie or Cannonball, a mutant who can... They describe him as a rocket that he can go from 1 to 100 really, really fast. It is such an incredibly niche and specific power. And then we have Henry Zaga as Bobby DaCosta or Sunspot. So right off the bat, from the comics, there are, which I have not read the New Mutants, there have been some criticisms from some of the creators of the comics, which is usually never a good sign, notably Bob McLeod. First off, because they misspell his name in the credits of the movie, that's not a joke, and also some whitewashings of certain characters, especially the character of Sunspot, who is much darker skinned in the original comics. The comics aside, although I do think it's important to note that and to talk about that, these 5 kids, basically, kind of bouncing around in your traditional teenage sort of things, the clash of hormones and the powers that are a metaphor for hormones and the danger of both of those things together doesn't make for a particularly inventive or new cocktail, but adding in the superhero elements and the general mystery of why are they in this hospital? Why can't they leave? Why is there a giant dome of magic energy around it that no one can get out of? Why do people start seeing horrible, nightmarish visions in their everyday lives? There's enough there to keep this movie going, and it is a short film. It is only 94 minutes long, which is such a weird relief of the superhero genre because almost everything is 2 hours plus nowadays. So seeing something that is short and sweet and quick is honestly a change I can get behind. The co-writer and director of the film is Josh Boone, who is most well known for doing the film adaptation of The Fault in Our Stars in 2015, which, sue me, it's a really good movie. I like it. I cry a lot, and that's fine. It doesn't make me less of a man to cry during that movie. It makes me more, because I am emotionally resonant, and that is important. But it is very clear that Boone, as a filmmaker, is at his best when he is doing small, intimate human moments. Just the direction of Charlie Heaton alone, who probably gives my favorite performance in this movie, just the little cracks in Heaton's voice as he's delivering these lines about his regret and his loss, it is affecting, if not particularly tear-jerking, but that as well as the small budding romance that happens between the characters of Danny and Rain is very sweet and a little unexpected and almost subversive. And maybe would have been a little more subversive if it had actually come out in early 2018 like it was planned to. Now it feels a little, just a few years older hat, but it's still a nice thing, and it kind of reminds us that, oh, why is this still subversive and why is this still new? And I think everything from the little touches like that to the spookier horror elements to the sadder moments all would have probably played a little bit better in a world 2 years before the one that we have. Before we had the biggest movie of all time be a superhero film where the first hour is just your childhood heroes have depression and survivor's guilt. The New Mutants, honestly, it probably would have felt a little bit dated even then. It is a movie that doesn't really follow the structure of how these superhero movies are being told. It feels much more in line with the Wild West of the genre from the early 2000s, where you have things like Blade and Spider-Man and the original X-Men films, and Daredevil and Ang Lee's Hulk and movies that are just throwing everything at the wall and trying to find out what sticks. That is my favorite type of superhero movie. And so, yeah, The New Mutants is a messy and kind of trite film that does not have anywhere near enough budget to pull off the special effects that it's trying to. But in 2003, those special effects were impossible. So there's a little bit of a charm to it. And there's a charm to this as well. There are giant creatures that show up near the end of this film, or characters going through immense transformations that give me the exact same feeling as in Daredevil, in the 2003 Daredevil, when we see the inside of Matt's head, of Ben Affleck's head, and the raindrops on Jennifer Garner's face make out like a weird approximation of what her face looks like, and that's supposed to be how he interprets information, because the rainwater hitting her face gives an image of her. It's ridiculous, and it's silly, and it's sweet. And I watched that movie 6 years ago, and I still remember that moment. And I think that's the thing that has endeared me to The New Mutants so much, despite its massive amounts of flaws, despite the fact that it doesn't push as many barriers as it probably promised. And the fact that as a horror film, this movie completely fails. It is not... There are a few moments that are kind of tense, but there is nothing that is outright scary. And I think a lot of that comes down to the concept of a superhero horror movie being a very dicey bet. And many people involved with the film have stated that while they are proud of the final product, it was not the original product pitched as a horror film. Which is fine. It happens. I'm much more grateful that everything seems to be on amicable terms, unlike something like the Fantastic Four reboot, where Fox just threw Josh Trank under the bus and said it's his fault, he was the problem, and I don't doubt that everything I've heard about the production of that film sounded like a nightmare, but it is nice to see that people are actually sticking together and being somewhat proud of this movie, because even though it doesn't work all too well, and even though it doesn't hit all of its marks, it is a movie that is trying new things and trying them in weird and complicated and convoluted and messy ways, and maybe it shouldn't be this messy. Maybe we have learned how this genre works to the point where it being messy isn't as much of an excuse as it once was, but damn it, it's fun. It's fun, and it feels like early teenage years. When you're watching stuff like even the phase 1 of the MCU with like the Incredible Hulk and the first Thor, and it's people who just haven't figured out the formula. They haven't figured out the magic juice that they can replicate over and over and over again. And yeah, we are getting a better return on investment with that strict formula for the superhero genre, but I miss movies like this. I miss weird, kind of out there stuff. Seeing the trailer for the new, soon-to-be-released Disney Plus show WandaVision is kind of giving me those similar vibes. It is nice, and it is good to have the most profitable and notable genre in film right now to do new and exciting things with their stories and with their storytelling. And The New Mutants is not the savior that I wanted it to be, but it is good. And I think we would all be a lot better if there were more movies like it that we could sit around and show to everyone we know. The New Mutants get 6 out of 10 stars. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I have been your host, Davey Peppers, and if you would be so kind as to leave us a little bit of a review, that really helps us out. And as well, if you could follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, it helps the show out a lot and gets visibility out and helps bump up that algorithm. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.